The wind on the high plains was a merciless sculptor, carving away at the land and the spirit with equal, indifferent force. It was the first thing Elara truly felt of her new life, a physical blow that stole the breath from her lungs and pressed the coarse fabric of her traveling dress against her skin, outlining a form she had been taught to despise. The wagon that had carried her here, a vessel of her humiliation, creaked away, its sound devoured by the immense, howling emptiness. Before her stood a cabin, little more than a smudge of sod and rough-hewn timber against an endless, bruised sky. It seemed to crouch low to the ground, as if hiding from the sheer vastness of the horizon. This was her destination. This was her penance. Back in the settlement of redemption, they had called it a marriage. Elara knew it for what it was, a disposal. Jedediah Thorne, a man whose wealth was matched only by his cruelty, had arranged it all as a grand, public jest. He had purchased her from her desperate father, a man broken by debt and shame, and presented her as a bride to Silas Cole. The joke had layers, each one sharper than the last. Elara, considered too stout, too broad, a surplus daughter no respectable man would court, was to be wed to Silas, a man the gossips whispered was barren as a salt flat, the infertile cowboy and the fat bride. A union destined for nothingness, a public monument to their shared perceived failures. The laughter in Thorne's saloon as the deal was struck had followed her for every mile of the journey, a ghostly chorus riding the wind. Now, the subject of that joke, Silas Cole, stood on the cabin's small porch. He was taller than she had expected, lean and weathered as the fence posts that marked his claim. He did not move, did not speak. His face was a mask of stoic neutrality, his eyes, the color of a winter sky, giving away nothing. There was no welcome in his posture, but there was no overt cruelty either. There was only a profound and weary stillness, as if he were a rock that had long ago decided to let the wind and rain have their way without protest. She clutched the handle of her single, battered valise, the worn leather a flimsy shield against the force of his gaze and the crushing weight of the open space. Fear was a cold, hard knot in her stomach. She had prepared for insults, for rage, for disgust. She had not prepared for this unnerving, absolute silence. It was a void she felt compelled to fill with apologies for her very existence, but the words died in her throat, choked by the dry, dusty air. The wind whipped a strand of her brown hair across her face, and for a moment, the world was obscured. In that sliver of darkness, despair was a tangible thing, a taste of ash on her tongue. She was utterly alone, a cast-off thing in a land that promised only hardship, shackled to a stranger who was as broken, in his own way, as she was. He finally moved, his boots scuffing softly on the wooden planks. He did not offer a hand for her bag, nor did he offer a word of greeting. He simply turned and pushed the door open, holding it for her to pass. The gesture was one of simple, non-committal necessity. It was an invitation not into a home, but into a shelter. As Elara stepped across the threshold, from the overwhelming emptiness of the plains into the dim, close confines of the cabin, she felt a profound and terrifying shift. The world she had known, with its stifling parlors and whispered judgments, was gone. This new world was one of raw survival, and its silence was more damning than any insult she had ever endured. The door closed behind her, the sound a dull thud of finality. The wind howled outside, a lament for the woman she had been, and a harbinger of the one she would have to become if she wished to see another spring. The first week was a study in silence, a choreography of two people moving through a space too small for secrets but vast enough for infinite distance. Elara unpacked her meager belongings in the small, curtained-off alcove that was to be her own. It was not a room, merely a suggestion of privacy. She laid out her brushes, her few books, and the small sewing kit her mother had given her years ago, the only token of a gentler time. These small objects seemed alien in the rustic sparseness of the cabin, like wildflowers attempting to grow in a stone quarry. Silas had given her a curt, single nod toward the alcove upon her arrival, the only instruction she had received. He slept on a simple cot on the other side of the main room, near the hearth. They were separated by a dozen feet of wooden floorboards that felt like a mile-wide chasm. Her days fell into a rhythm born of nervous energy and a desperate need to prove her worth, if only to herself. She rose before the sun, the chill of the cabin floor seeping through her stockings. While Silas was outside, tending to his few horses and mending the fences that perpetually surrendered to the wind, Ilara claimed the cabin's interior. She scrubbed the floors until the wood gleamed faintly in the lamplight. She cleaned the soot from the stone fireplace, organized the sparse pantry, and took stock of their provisions. She found sacks of flour, beans, salted pork, and little else. There was a hardness to this life, an absence of any softness or grace. She began to cook, not with flair, but with a quiet, determined efficiency. The first meal she made was a simple stew. When Silas came in from the cold, his face raw from the wind, the scent of it filled the small space. He stopped just inside the door, his gaze flickering from the bubbling pot to her face. He said nothing. He simply washed his hands in the basin, sat at the small, rough table, and ate. Ilara sat opposite him, her own food tasting of ashes, her every muscle tensed for a critique that never came. He ate every last bit, pushed the empty bowl away, and gave a short, almost imperceptible nod. It was not praise, but it was not condemnation. It was an acknowledgement. An acceptance of her labor. In the crushing silence, it felt like a roar of approval. She began to observe him, to learn the contours of his quiet existence. He was a man of immense physical discipline. His work was his language. The way he gentled a skittish horse, his hands firm but patient, the methodical way he repaired a broken harness, his fingers surprisingly nimble, the grim determination with which he dug a new post-hole in the unyielding earth, these were his sentences, his paragraphs, his declarations. He never complained. The land was a harsh master, and he met its cruelty with a matching, relentless resolve. She saw the deep weariness in his shoulders at the end of the day, the way his hands, calloused and scarred, would sometimes tremble slightly as he lifted a cup of coffee to his lips. She began to see not the infertile cowboy of the town's cruel caricature, but a man locked in a solitary, unending battle against a world that had offered him no quarter. His silence was not a rejection of her, she started to realize, but a shield he had built around himself long before she had ever arrived. One evening, a storm blew in, a furious, shrieking entity that threw sheets of rain and hail against the cabin. The wind clawed at the roof, and the timbers groaned in protest. The world outside was a churning vortex of blackness and noise. Ilara, who had always been afraid of storms, found herself staring into the fire, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. Silas sat at the table, mending a leather strap, his movements as calm and deliberate as ever. The lamp cast a small circle of golden light, a fragile island in the heart of the tempest. Suddenly, a gust of wind tore at the window shutter, ripping it from one of its leather hinges. It began to bang violently against the wall, a frantic, percussive rhythm of panic. Before Ilara could even cry out, Silas was on his feet. He grabbed his heavy coat and a length of rope and was out the door, disappearing into the maelstrom. She rushed to the window, peering through the rain-streaked glass. She could just make out his form, a dark shape battling the wind, struggling to secure the broken shutter. He was a silhouette of pure grit, fighting to protect the small sanctuary they shared. He was not just protecting his property, he was protecting her from the storm. When he finally came back inside, soaked to the bone and shivering, his face grim, he did not look at her. He went straight to the fire to warm himself. But Ilara saw. She saw the act for what it was, a choice. He had faced the storm for them. That night, she took the heavy quilt from her own bed and, while he slept, draped it over his cot. It was a gesture as silent and as significant as his had been. The unspoken treaty between them solidified as autumn bled into the harsh, unforgiving winter. The landscape, once a tapestry of muted browns and golds, was now a stark canvas of white and grey. The world shrank to the dimensions of the cabin, the barn, and the short, perilous path between them. It was a time of immense labor and shared vulnerability. One morning, the snow was so deep Silas could not force the cabin door open. He put his shoulder to it, his breath pluming in the frigid air, but it wouldn't budge. Without a word, Ilara grabbed the heavy fireplace shovel and began digging at the drift from the inside, clearing the base of the door. He watched her, his expression unreadable, then nodded and joined her, using a piece of firewood to scrape away the impacted snow. Together, they forced it open, a small victory against the overwhelming power of the winter. They stood for a moment in the doorway, the frigid air a shock to the system, looking out at a world erased by white. In that shared moment of effort, a new kind of warmth bloomed between them, one that had nothing to do with the fire in the hearth. Ilara's skills, once merely domestic, became essential tools for survival. She discovered a resourcefulness she never knew she possessed. She learned to render tallow for candles, to mend Silas's worn clothing with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible, and to stretch their meager rations with a surprising ingenuity. Her bread was always dense and nourishing, her stews hearty and warming. She was not just occupying a space in his home, she was actively fortifying it against the relentless siege of the plains. Silas, in turn, began to acknowledge her contributions in his own quiet way. He carved a new, sturdier handle for her favorite cast-iron skillet. He built a small shelf next to her alcove for her books. One afternoon, he came inside from the biting wind, his hands carrying not firewood or tools, but a small, scrawny rabbit he had managed to trap. He laid it on the table without a word. It was more than just food, it was a provision, a recognition of her role in their shared existence. He provided the raw materials, and she transformed them into comfort and sustenance. Their conversations remained sparse, but they were no longer empty. They were economical, each word carrying weight. Morwood needed the grey mare is limping, snow feels heavy. These were not pleasantries, they were vital communications, the language of their partnership. One evening, as she was darning one of his socks, the needle slipped, and she pricked her finger. A single drop of blood welled up, dark against her skin. She flinched, putting the finger to her lips. Silas, who had been cleaning his rifle, looked up. His gaze was sharp, focused. He rose from his chair, went to a small wooden box on the mantelpiece, and came back with a tin of antiseptic salve. He didn't speak, just held it out to her. She took it, her fingers brushing his. His hand was rough and calloused, yet his touch was surprisingly gentle. The small, ordinary gesture was imbued with a profound sense of care. It was an acknowledgement of her pain, a simple, direct offering of comfort. In that moment, the ghost of Jedediah Thorne's cruel laughter seemed to fade, replaced by the quiet reality of the man before her, a man who battled storms and tended to small wounds with the same grave seriousness. He was no longer just her keeper, he was becoming her partner. And the cabin, once a prison of shame, was slowly, inexplicably, beginning to feel like a home. The thaw came late, a slow, grudging retreat of winter. Meltwater dripped from the eaves, and the vast whiteness of the plains broke apart, revealing the muddy, sleeping earth beneath. With the spring came a renewed sense of possibility, a fragile hope that felt as new and tentative as the first green shoots pushing through the soil. The cabin, which had been their entire world, now felt confining. They spent more time outside, breathing air that no longer bit at their lungs. Ilara found a small, sheltered patch of earth near the cabin and, with a determination that surprised even herself, decided to plant a garden. Silas watched her from a distance as she struggled to break the tough sod with a rusty spade. The work was grueling, her hands, accustomed to needles and cloth, quickly blistering and aching. After 2 days of her solitary, back-breaking labor, she came out one morning to find a large section of the plot already turned over, the dark soil broken into fine, manageable clods. Silas was nowhere in sight, already out on the range, but the evidence of his pre-dawn work was unmistakable. He had not offered to help, had not commented on her endeavor. He had simply seen her struggle and, in the quiet of the early morning, had lent his strength to her cause. A lump formed in Ilara's throat. It was the most eloquent speech he had ever given. She worked the soil he had prepared, her hand sinking into the cool, rich earth. She planted seeds for carrots, potatoes, and beans, hardy, sensible vegetables that could withstand the caprices of the plains. Tending to that small patch of land became her ritual. It was a tangible act of creation, a defiant claim on the future. She was not just surviving anymore, she was cultivating. As the sun grew warmer, their lives expanded outward. Silas began working a distant corner of his claim, meaning he was sometimes gone from sunup until well after sundown. The first time he left for the day, a sliver of the old fear returned to Ilara. The silence of the cabin felt different, emptier. But then she looked at her burgeoning garden, at the sturdy walls of the home they had weathered a winter in, and the fear receded. She had her own work, her own purpose. She was not a dependent, waiting for his return, she was a homesteader, managing her part of their shared enterprise. She began to explore the land around the cabin, her initial fear of the vastness replaced by a growing familiarity. She learned the calls of the different birds, the subtle shifts in the wind that heralded a change in weather, the places where wild herbs grew. The plains were no longer a terrifying void but a landscape rich with detail and life. Her body, once a source of shame in the corseted world of redemption, was strong and capable here. It could carry water, all firewood, and spend hours under the sun without complaint. For the first time, she felt a sense of gratitude for its resilience. One afternoon, while mending a fence line not far from the cabin, a calf got itself tangled in a thicket of thorny brush. Its panic bleating was sharp and desperate. Ilara ran to it, her heart pounding. The mother cow watched from a distance, lowing anxiously. The thorns were deep, tearing at the calf's delicate skin as it struggled. Ilara spoke to it in a low, soothing voice, the same tone Silas used with the horses. She moved slowly, carefully, her hands reaching into the thorny mess. The branches scratched and tore at her arms, but she ignored the sting. With painstaking patience, she broke the branches one by one, untangling the calf's legs until it was finally free. It scrambled to its feet and ran to its mother. Ilara stood, her arms bleeding in a dozen places, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and felt a surge of fierce, triumphant pride. She had faced a crisis, acted with courage, and succeeded. When Silas returned that evening, he noticed the scratches on her arms immediately. His gaze sharpened with concern. "Calf," she said simply, gesturing toward the pasture. In the thorns he looked at her arms, then out toward the herd where the calf was nursing safely, and then back at her. He didn't say thank you or well done, he didn't have to. He went inside and returned with a tin of salve and a clean cloth. He gently, methodically, cleaned and treated each and every scratch on her arms. His touch was a silent acknowledgement, a testament to her strength. In his care, she felt not weak or wounded, but seen. The turning point came not with a whisper, but with the thundering sound of hooves. It was a hot, dry afternoon in late summer when Jedediah Thorne and two of his hired men rode onto their land. They did not approach the cabin with courtesy, but reined in their horses directly in front of Ilara's garden, the animals' hooves trampling her carefully tended carrot tops. Thorne, fleshy and smug in his expensive saddle, surveyed the scene with a contemptuous smirk. He had come to gloat, to see the wreckage of his cruel joke. He expected to find two miserable souls, broken by hardship and each other's company. He looked from the neat, thriving garden to the sturdy, well-kept cabin, and his smirk faltered for a fraction of a second. Silas emerged from the barn, holding a pitchfork. He did not hold it as a weapon, but he did not put it down either. He moved to stand beside Ilara, placing himself slightly in front of her. The two of them stood together, a silent, unbreachable unit. "Cole," Thorne sneered, recovering his composure. "Come to see how my little gift is settling in." Figured by now she'd have eaten you out of house and home, his men chuckled, a harsh, ugly sound that grated on the peaceful afternoon. Ilara felt a flash of the old, familiar shame, a hot wave of humiliation. But then she looked at Silas's rigid back, at the callus on her own hands, at the green and living things she had coaxed from this unforgiving soil. The shame curdled into a cold, hard anger. "She's a fine wife," Silas said, his voice low and even, yet carrying across the yard with absolute clarity. It was, perhaps, the longest sentence he had ever spoken to another man in her presence. The words hung in the air, a stunning, irrefutable statement. Thorne blinked, thrown off balance. This was not the broken, silent man he remembered. "And this is our land," Silas continued, his grip tightening on the pitchfork. "You're not welcome here." Thorne's face flushed a deep, angry red. "Your land? This pitiful patch of dust? I hold the note on this place, Cole. You miss one payment, and I'll see you both thrown out into the dirt where you belong." He spat on the ground, a glob of brown tobacco juice landing perilously close to Ilara's foot. It was then that Ilara stepped forward, moving from behind Silas to stand beside him. She was not the trembling, shamed woman who had arrived in a wagon months ago. Her posture was straight, her gaze level. She looked directly at Jedediah Thorne, her eyes holding no fear. "You gave my husband a wife, Mr. Thorne," she said, her voice steady and clear, imbued with a dignity he had never imagined she possessed. "And he has given me a home. We are building a life here. Your jokes have no power over that." Her words, spoken with such quiet, unshakable conviction, were more powerful than any threat. They stripped him of his power, turning his mockery into a hollow, pathetic echo. Thorne stared at her, his mouth slightly agape. He saw not the fat bride he had sought to humiliate, but a formidable woman, the mistress of her domain. He looked from her resolute face to Silas's unyielding stance, and he saw not two broken outcasts, but a partnership forged in steel and silence. He saw that his joke had backfired spectacularly. With a curse, he wrenched his horse's reins, turned, and galloped away, his men scrambling to follow. They left behind only trampled carrots and a profound, ringing silence. Silas finally lowered the pitchfork. He turned to Ilara, and for the first time, she saw something in his eyes that went beyond respect or partnership. It was a look of deep, quiet, and overwhelming pride. The dust settled, and with it, the last vestiges of Jedediah Thorne's shadow. His retreat was more than a momentary victory, it was a fundamental shift in the balance of their world. News of the confrontation traveled, as news always did, carried on the wind from one homestead to the next. The story, however, was not the one Thorne would have told. It was a tale of the quiet man, Silas Cole, and his surprisingly formidable wife, who had stood together and faced down the richest, cruelest man in the territory. They were no longer the butt of a joke. They were becoming a local legend. People who had once pitied or scorned them began to look at them with a new respect. When they rode into the settlement for supplies, the whispers that followed them were no longer mocking, but tinged with awe. Life on the homestead deepened into a richer harmony. The unspoken understanding between Ilara and Silas blossomed into a gentle, unspoken affection. The spaces between their words were no longer filled with tension, but with a comfortable, companionable silence. They moved around each other with an instinctual grace, their separate labors weaving together to form a single, strong tapestry of a life. He would leave a bucket of fresh, clean water for her garden on the porch in the mornings. She would have a hot cup of coffee waiting for him when he came in from a long day, his weariness etched onto his face. These small, consistent acts of service were their love language, more honest and profound than any flowery prose. One evening, as a cool autumn breeze rustled the dry leaves, Ilara was sitting by the fire, reading one of her books. Silas was at the table, methodically sharpening a set of knives, the rhythmic scrape of steel on stone a soothing sound in the quiet cabin. He stopped his work and looked at her, his gaze thoughtful. "My father," he began, his voice raspy from disuse, "he believed a man's worth was in the sons he sired. The legacy he left in the blood." He paused, his eyes dropping to his scarred hands. "When my first wife, Mary, couldn't conceive. And then the doctor said the fault was mine. The town looked at me like I was already dead. A hollow man, it was the most he had ever revealed of himself, a wound laid bare in the warm, safe light of the fire." Ilara closed her book and looked at him, her heart aching with a fierce empathy. She thought of the shame she had carried for the shape of her body, a parallel burden of perceived worthlessness. She rose from her chair and walked to the table, standing behind him. She gently placed her hands on his shoulders. He tensed for a moment, then relaxed under her touch, a slow, deep sigh escaping him. "A legacy isn't only in blood, Silas," she said softly, her voice thick with emotion. "It's in the earth you turn. It's in the shelter you build against the storm. It's in the reputation you earn for being a good and decent man." She squeezed his shoulders gently. "This home. This is our legacy. What we've built here." Together he reached up and placed one of his rough hands over hers, his thumb stroking the back of her hand. They stayed that way for a long time, in the quiet of the cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth. The ghosts of their pasts, the scorn of the town, the cruelty of men like Thorn, all seemed to dissolve in the profound, healing stillness of that moment. They were not the sum of their perceived deficiencies. They were two whole people who had found their value not in the judgment of others, but in each other. As the years passed, the Cole homestead became a landmark, an example of what grit and partnership could achieve on the high plains. Their garden expanded, producing enough surplus to trade for goods in town. Their herd of horses grew, known for being strong and well-tempered, a reflection of their master. Ilara, once the too-fat bride, was now spoken of with immense respect. Neighboring women came to her for advice on gardening, for her remedies for ailments, and sometimes, just to sit in the quiet warmth of her kitchen. They saw not her size, but her strength, her wisdom, and the deep, unshakable peace that radiated from her. She had a presence as powerful and as rooted as the ancient cottonwood tree that grew by the creek. Silas, too, was transformed. The weary hardness in his eyes had softened, replaced by a quiet contentment. He still spoke little, but he smiled more, small, private smiles meant only for Ilara. He was no longer the infertile cowboy, the town's cautionary tale. He was Silas Cole, a man who had built a prosperous life against all odds, a man whose greatest pride was the home he shared with his wife. Their partnership was a living thing, a testament to the fact that true growth often comes from the soil of hardship. They had been given to each other as a punishment, a cruel joke meant to highlight their inadequacies. But in the vast, unforgiving silence of the plains, far from the judging eyes of the world, they had found a different truth. They had discovered that their supposed weaknesses were irrelevant. What mattered was resilience, kindness, and the quiet courage to build a life on one's own terms. One crisp, golden evening, they stood on the porch, watching the sun set over the plains. The sky was a riot of orange and purple, casting long shadows across the land they had tamed together. A gentle breeze, no longer a merciless tyrant but a familiar whisper, carried the scent of hay and dry earth. Silas wordlessly reached out and took Ilara's hand in his. Her hand, no longer soft and delicate, but strong and capable, fit perfectly in his. They did not need to speak of their journey, of the shame and fear that had brought them to this place. It was all there in their shared gaze, in the comfortable weight of their joined hands. The world had tried to define them by what they lacked. But here, on this vast expanse of land that they had made their own, they were defined only by what they had built. She was not the cast-off bride, she was the heart of this home. And he was not the barren man, he was the husband who had helped her flourish. Together, they were more than survivors. They were the quiet, resilient, and undeniable pride of the plains.